He wasn't buying junk. He was buying the last thin thread between him and disappearing completely. And on that cold Thursday morning, with $47 left in his pocket and nowhere left to sleep that night, Daniel Hayes stood in a gravel lot behind a row of rusted storage units that smelled like dust, oil, and forgotten years, the kind of place where people came to get rid of what they didn't want to remember. And the wind moved slow through the metal corridors, carrying the hollow clang of rolling doors and the low murmur of men who had more money than hope, while Daniel had the opposite, too much hope for a man who had already lost almost everything, his boots worn thin at the heels, his jacket one winter away from falling apart. And beside him stood Rex, a German shepherd with a sable coat dulled by time, but eyes still sharp, still searching, still believing in something Daniel himself had started to question. Because once, not so long ago, Daniel had been a Marine who could read a room before stepping into it, who could feel danger before it showed its face. But now he read price tags and empty faces and counted coins in his palm like they were decisions that could change the shape of a life. And maybe they could, because today, those $47 weren't just money. They were 2 nights of cheap motel warmth or a week of gas station meals. Or maybe, just maybe, something else entirely. Something he couldn't name yet. Something Rex seemed to sense. Before he did, because the dog stood still in a way that wasn't normal, not distracted, not tired, just focused, his ears slightly forward, his breathing slow, his gaze locked on a single storage unit halfway down the row, its door still shut, its number half peeled and barely readable under layers of grime. And Daniel noticed it the way you notice something you weren't supposed to. A quiet pull, like a memory trying to surface, while the auctioneer called out numbers in a voice that bounced off the metal walls, fast, practiced, indifferent. Another unit sold, another life reduced to whatever someone else was willing to pay. And Daniel shifted his weight, feeling the cold gravel under his boots, feeling the weight of Rex's presence beside him, steady, grounding, the one constant that hadn't left, hadn't judged, hadn't walked away. And when Rex took a single step forward, just one, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, Daniel felt it like a signal, not loud, not urgent, but certain, the kind of certainty he remembered from a different life, a life where instincts mattered more than explanations, where hesitation could cost everything. And he swallowed hard, glancing down at the worn bills in his hand, then back at the unopened unit, its silence heavier than the noise around it. And for a brief second, the world seemed to narrow, the voices fading, the wind stilling, until it was just him, the dog, and a closed door that no one else cared about. And he didn't know why, couldn't explain it, but something in his chest tightened in a way that felt almost like purpose, fragile but real, like a spark in a place that had gone too long without light. And the auctioneer's voice cut through again, sharp, calling for the next bid, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air, his fingers tightening around the last money he had, while Rex didn't move, didn't look away, just waited, as if he already knew that whatever was behind that door wasn't junk, not really, not to them. And in that quiet, suspended moment between losing everything and risking what little remained, Daniel Hayes made the kind of decision that doesn't feel like courage when you're making it, only later, when you realize it was the only thing that kept you from disappearing altogether. The bid came faster than he expected, a number tossed into the cold air like it meant nothing. And for most of the men standing there it probably did not. Just another gamble in a morning full of them. But for Daniel Hayes it felt like stepping onto thin ice with no way back, his voice rough when he said it, almost swallowed by the wind. But it was enough for the auctioneer to nod, enough for a few heads to turn, enough for someone in the back to let out a short laugh that carried the quiet kind of judgment people reserve for strangers they think they understand. And Daniel did not look at them. He kept his eyes on the metal door with the peeling number, because looking away now felt like doubt, and doubt was something he had learned to survive without. And beside him Rex stood unmoving, steady as a shadow, as if the decision had already been made long before Daniel spoke it out loud, as if the outcome was not something to fear, but something already written in a place Daniel could not see. And when the auctioneer dropped his gavel with a sharp crack that echoed through the narrow corridor, it sounded final in a way that settled into Daniel's chest. Not heavy, not yet, just real, and the small crowd began to drift, boots crunching against gravel, voices fading into other transactions, other lives. While Daniel stepped forward slowly, each step measured, feeling the weight of what he had just traded away. $47 for a locked space full of someone else's past. And he reached the door, his hand hovering for a second before touching the cold metal, the surface rough beneath his fingers, dust clinging to his skin. And he exhaled through his nose, steadying himself the way he used to before opening doors in a different kind of place. Back when doors meant uncertainty of a different kind. Back when he had people behind him instead of silence. And he pulled, the door groaning as it lifted, inch by inch, the sound long and dragging, like something reluctant to be revealed. And as the gap widened, light slipped inside, cutting through the dim interior and settling over shapes that did not look like anything worth saving. Boxes collapsed under their own weight. Furniture with broken legs, plastic bins cracked open, papers scattered and yellowed with age, the kind of clutter that told a story of someone who had left in a hurry or never came back at all. And Daniel stood there, letting the door rise fully until it locked into place with a dull click. And for a moment he said nothing, did nothing, just looked, because sometimes disappointment does not hit all at once, it seeps in slowly, filling the space where hope had been a second before. And he stepped inside, boots crunching softly over debris, the air stale, carrying a faint smell of mildew and old wood. And he bent down to pick up a small cardboard box near the entrance, its edges soft from time. And when he opened it, it held nothing but torn magazines and a rusted kitchen utensil, nothing that could be sold, nothing that could be used, just remnants. And he set it aside, moving deeper into the unit, shifting items with careful motions, not rushing, not yet ready to admit what it looked like. Because sometimes the difference between giving up and continuing is just a few more seconds of pretending there might still be something worth finding. And behind him Rex stepped in quietly, his paws making almost no sound, his presence filling the small space in a way that made it feel less empty. And while Daniel continued to sift through the obvious, lifting a broken lamp, pushing aside a stack of warped books, Rex did something different. He did not explore randomly. He did not sniff every corner the way a dog normally would. Instead, he walked in a straight line toward the back left corner, where the light barely reached and the shadows settled thicker. And he stopped there, standing still, his head slightly lowered, his nose close to the ground, but not touching it, as if he was listening to something beneath the surface rather than smelling it. And Daniel noticed it only after a moment, the absence of movement, the quiet focus, and he straightened slowly, watching the dog, a familiar tension building in his chest, the kind that did not come from fear but from recognition, because he had seen that posture before, in places where attention meant everything. And he took a step closer, brushing dust from his hands, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at the patch of concrete Rex had chosen. Nothing different at first glance, just more dirt, more neglect. But Rex did not move, did not look away. He simply remained there, waiting, as if the real contents of the unit had not yet been revealed, as if everything Daniel had seen so far was only the surface of something still hidden, something that required patience. And in that quiet corner, away from the discarded noise of the rest of the unit, the air felt different, heavier in a way Daniel could not explain. And he crouched down slowly beside the dog, his hand hovering just above Rex's back without touching him, grounding himself in the presence of the only thing in his life that had not failed him. And for a long second neither of them moved, the world outside fading again into distant sound, until Daniel finally spoke under his breath, his voice low, almost uncertain, as if asking a question he was not sure he was ready to hear answered. "What is it, boy?" Daniel did not reach for a tool right away. He simply stared at the ground where Rex stood, as if expecting the concrete itself to explain what the dog already seemed to understand. And for a moment nothing happened, just the faint hum of distant traffic outside the storage lot, and the soft shift of dust in the stale air, until Rex lowered his head further and pressed his nose gently against the surface, not scratching yet, not digging wildly, just a slow, deliberate touch. Then he looked up at Daniel, and it was not a look of excitement or confusion. It was something quieter, something certain, the kind of look that asked for trust without needing to explain why. And Daniel felt it settle into him the same way it used to before long patrols, That quiet signal that said, "Pay attention. This matters." And he let out a slow breath, glancing around the unit again as if to confirm what he already knew, that nothing else in this space had called out to him the way this small patch of ground did. And he shifted closer, lowering himself onto one knee, his joints stiff from nights spent in the back seat of a car that had long stopped being reliable, and he brushed his hand across the concrete, feeling the thin layer of dust, the grit, the uneven texture. But beneath that, something else, something just slightly off, not obvious, not enough for anyone rushing through to notice, but enough for someone who had learned to read the smallest differences. And he leaned in closer, running his fingers along the edge where the concrete met a thin seam, almost invisible, like a line drawn and then forgotten, and his brow tightened slightly, not from frustration, but from recognition, because this was not random, this was placed, intentional. And he reached back instinctively, grabbing a piece of broken wood from the scattered debris nearby, its edge splintered but firm enough, and he pressed it into the seam, testing, not forcing, just enough pressure to feel resistance, and for a second nothing gave, just the quiet tension of a surface that did not want to move. And then, with a subtle shift, a faint scrape, the wood slipped just a fraction deeper. And that was all it took, that small confirmation, that this was not just another forgotten corner. And Daniel paused, his hand still, his eyes flicking to Rex, who had not moved an inch, watching, steady, as if this moment belonged to both of them. And Daniel felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something close to it, something cautious, like the first light before sunrise when you are not sure if the day will be warm or cold. And he adjusted his grip on the wood, applying a bit more pressure, levering it carefully, the way he had learned to open things that were not meant to be opened easily. And the seam shifted again, just enough to reveal a narrow gap, no wider than a finger, but enough to confirm what Rex had already known. And the sound it made was soft, almost reluctant, like the unit itself was holding on to whatever it had been hiding. And Daniel's breath slowed, his focus narrowing, everything else falling away as he worked the edge a little more, patient, controlled, until the section of concrete lifted slightly, revealing darkness beneath, not deep, but hidden, a shallow compartment built into the floor, something no one would have seen unless they were looking for it. And he stopped there, not opening it fully yet, just holding the edge up enough to see that it existed, because sometimes the moment before discovery is heavier than the discovery itself. And he glanced at Rex again, his voice barely above a whisper, steady but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "You knew, did you not?" And Rex did not bark, did not move closer. He simply held Daniel's gaze, calm, certain, and in that silence, Daniel understood something he had almost forgotten, that not everything valuable makes noise. Some things wait, quietly, for the right hands to find them. And as he looked back down at the hidden space beneath the concrete, the stale air of the storage unit seemed to shift, just slightly, as if the place itself was no longer empty, but holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Daniel did not rush to open it, not because he was afraid of what might be inside, but because something in him understood that once he lifted that hidden lid completely, whatever came next would not let him go back to the man he had been just an hour ago, standing outside with $47 and nothing else. And he steadied his hand against the rough edge of the concrete, feeling the slight tremor in his fingers that he had not felt in years, not since the days when every unknown carried weight. And he exhaled slowly through his nose, grounding himself, while Rex remained beside him, quiet, watchful, his presence filling the small space with something that felt almost like reassurance. And Daniel finally shifted his grip, easing the slab upward just enough to widen the opening. The movement slow, controlled, the way you handle something that might break if you force it. And as the gap opened further, the darkness beneath gave way to shape, not random, not chaotic like the rest of the unit, but deliberate, contained, a single object placed carefully within the hidden compartment. And Daniel leaned in closer, the faint smell of aged metal rising up to meet him, dry and cold, untouched by the air above. And there it was, a small steel box, about the size of a shoebox, its surface worn but intact, edges clean, no rust eating through it the way everything else in the unit had been claimed by time. And for a moment he simply looked at it, not reaching yet, Because the difference between junk and something kept hidden is not always in its appearance, it is in the intention behind it. And this had been hidden with purpose, not forgotten. And he swallowed, his throat dry, before sliding his hand carefully into the compartment, his fingers brushing the cool surface of the box. And when he lifted it, it had weight, not heavy enough to strain him, but solid, real, the kind of weight that suggested substance rather than emptiness. And he brought it up slowly, setting it down on the concrete beside him, the faint sound it made as it touched the floor echoing softly in the unit. And Rex shifted slightly closer, lowering his head just enough to rest his chin near Daniel's knee, his eyes never leaving the box, as if whatever was inside belonged as much to him as it did to Daniel. And Daniel ran his fingers along the lid, tracing the edges, feeling for a latch, a seam, anything that would tell him how to open it. And he found it on the front, a simple clasp, not locked, just secured, as if whoever placed it here had not been trying to keep it from being opened, only from being found too easily. And that thought settled into him, quiet but heavy, because it meant this was not meant to be lost forever, only hidden until the right moment, or the right person. And Daniel hesitated again, his hand hovering just above the clasp, his mind flickering with questions he could not answer. Who had owned this? Why it had been left? Why it had been hidden instead of taken? But none of those questions mattered as much as the one thing sitting in front of him, waiting. And he pressed his thumb against the latch, feeling the slight resistance before it gave way with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the stillness of the unit. And he lifted the lid slowly, not snapping it open, not rushing the moment, because something about it felt like crossing a line. And as the lid rose, the inside revealed itself piece by piece, not with a flash of gold or anything that would make a man shout, but with something quieter, something that made Daniel's breath catch in a different way. Because inside the box were not stacks of cash or glittering objects, but rows of carefully arranged envelopes, old, yellowed with age but preserved, each one sealed, each one marked with a name written in steady, deliberate handwriting, and beneath them, a smaller bundle wrapped in cloth, tied with a thin cord that had been knotted with care. And Daniel stared at it, his brow tightening slightly, not from disappointment, but from confusion. Because this was not what most people would call valuable, not in the way the world measured worth, and yet it had been hidden beneath concrete, protected, kept. And he reached in slowly, lifting one of the envelopes, his fingers brushing the paper as if it might crumble under too much pressure. And he turned it over, reading the name written across the front, a name he did not recognize, but something about it, the way it had been written, the care in each letter, made it feel important, made it feel like this box held more than objects. It held pieces of something that had mattered deeply to someone. And Daniel felt that unfamiliar tension in his chest again, not disappointment, not relief, but something in between, something that asked him to look closer, to understand before judging. And beside him Rex let out a slow breath, almost a sigh, as if confirming what Daniel had not yet fully grasped. That whatever this was, it was not random, it was not worthless, it was something waiting to be understood. And Daniel lowered the envelope back into place carefully, his movements slower now, more deliberate, because he realized in that moment that the value of what he had found might not reveal itself all at once, and that this, whatever it was, would require patience, the same kind of patience that had brought him to this exact spot, guided not by logic, not by chance, but by something quieter, something that had led a dog to stand still in the corner of a forgotten unit and refused to move until the truth beneath the surface was finally uncovered. Daniel sat there longer than he expected, the open metal box resting between his knees, the edges of the envelopes catching the faint light that filtered through the doorway. And for a moment he did nothing but breathe, slow and measured, as if rushing would break something fragile that had been waiting far longer than he had been there. And he reached in again, this time choosing an envelope at random, though it did not feel random at all, his fingers hesitating for just a fraction of a second, before sliding it free, the paper making a soft whisper as it left its place among the others. And he turned it over once more, studying the name written on the front, the ink slightly faded but still clear, each letter shaped with care, not rushed, not careless. And there was something about that detail that pressed into him, because people do not write like that unless it matters, unless the person on the other end of that envelope meant something worth slowing down for, and Daniel carefully opened the flap, his movements deliberate, respectful in a way he did not consciously choose, and he pulled out a folded sheet of paper, the edges worn but intact, and as he unfolded it, the faint scent of old paper rose into the air, dry and quiet, carrying with it the weight of time, and his eyes moved across the lines slowly, not scanning, but reading, really reading, and the words were simple at first, not grand, not dramatic, just a letter, written from one person to another. But as he continued, something shifted, something deeper, because it was not just information on a page, it was a voice, a memory, a moment captured and preserved, and Daniel felt it settle into him in a way he had not expected, because it reminded him of something he had not touched in a long time. The feeling of being connected to someone beyond the present moment, beyond survival, beyond the next meal or the next place to sleep, and he lowered the letter slightly, his eyes lingering on the last line before he folded it back carefully, not creasing it more than necessary, and he placed it back into the envelope with the same care it had been written with. And for a second, he just sat there, the quiet of the unit wrapping around him, the outside world distant and unimportant, and Rex shifted closer again, pressing lightly against his side, not demanding attention, just there, grounding, and Daniel let his hand rest briefly on the dog's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm, the slow rise and fall of breath that had not changed since the moment they stepped inside, and he looked back down at the box, at the rows of envelopes, and then at the small bundle wrapped in cloth beneath them, and something in him understood that the letters were only part of it, that whatever had been hidden here had layers, pieces that revealed themselves slowly, not all at once, and he reached for the cloth-wrapped bundle, lifting it gently, feeling its weight, lighter than the metal box but heavier than the paper, and the cord around it was tied in a simple knot, not tight, not meant to resist, just enough to keep it closed, and he untied it carefully, the fibers loosening with a soft pull, and as the cloth unfolded, it revealed what had been inside, not gold, not stacks of bills, but a small collection of items placed together with intention, a worn military dog tag, a photograph slightly bent at the corners, and a folded document that looked official, its edges crisp compared to everything else in the box, and Daniel stared at them, his breath catching just slightly, because even before he picked them up, he could feel the shift, the way this was no longer just about someone else's story. It was beginning to brush against something closer, something familiar, and he reached for the dog tag first, lifting it between his fingers, the metal cool against his skin, the engraved letters catching the light just enough to be read, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he focused, reading the name, the numbers, the small details that carried more weight than they appeared to, and something inside him stirred, not recognition exactly, but proximity, like standing near a memory you cannot fully place, and he set the tag down gently, picking up the photograph next, and as he looked at it, the image revealed itself slowly. A man standing beside a German shepherd, both facing the camera, both still, the kind of stillness that comes from trust, from time spent together, and Daniel felt his chest tighten, not from sadness, not yet, but from something deeper, something that had been buried under months of surviving instead of living, and he exhaled slowly, his gaze lingering on the dog in the photograph, the posture, the eyes, the quiet strength that mirrored the one sitting beside him now. And for a moment the distance between past and present felt thinner, like a line that could be crossed if he kept looking, and he lowered the photograph carefully, placing it back on the cloth, his movements slower now, more deliberate, because he understood that this was no longer about finding something to sell or trade. This was about uncovering something that had been meant to be found, something that carried weight beyond money, beyond immediate survival. And as he sat there in the dim light of the storage unit, with dust in the air and silence pressing in from every side, Daniel Hayes realized that whatever he had just uncovered was not going to change his life in the way he had expected, but in a way he had not even known he needed. Daniel did not pick up the document right away, even though it sat there in front of him, clean, official, different from everything else in the box, because something about it carried a weight that the letters and the photograph had only begun to hint at, and he felt it in the way his fingers hovered just above it, The way his breathing slowed without him telling it to. As if his body understood before his mind did that this piece of paper mattered in a way that would not be easily undone. And Rex shifted slightly beside him, the faint brush of fur against Daniel's arm grounding him just enough to move forward. And he reached out, lifting the document carefully, holding it by the edges as if it might hold something fragile beyond the paper itself. And when he unfolded it, the crispness of it stood in contrast to everything else, preserved, protected, as if it had been meant to last, and his eyes moved across the printed line slowly, taking in the formal language, the seals, the signatures, the kind of details that belonged to a world of order and structure. A world Daniel had once been part of but now felt distant, and as he read, the pieces began to connect, not all at once, but gradually, like a picture forming in low light. And he realized that this was not just a collection of memories stored away. It was a record, something legal, something that carried authority, and his brow tightened slightly as he focused on the key lines, the ones that mattered, the ones that explained why this box had been hidden instead of discarded. And there it was, written plainly, unmistakably, a statement of ownership, of transfer, of something set aside for a future moment. And Daniel felt a subtle shift in his chest, not a surge, not excitement, but a quiet realization that what he held in his hands was not just meaningful, it was actionable. And he glanced back at the name on the dog tag, then at the photograph, then at the envelopes, and the connection deepened. This had all belonged to one person, someone who had taken the time to gather these pieces, to preserve them, to hide them where they would not be easily found, and yet not lock them away completely, not erase them. And Daniel's mind moved carefully through the implications, not jumping ahead, not assuming, but recognizing that whatever had been left here had been done with intention. And he lowered the document slightly, his gaze drifting for a moment as he sat with that understanding, the storage unit around him no longer feeling like a place of discarded things, but like a quiet archive, a space holding a story that had not finished being told. And Rex let out a slow breath again, his presence steady, unchanged, as if this unfolding was simply the natural progression of something already set in motion. And Daniel folded the document back along its original lines, placing it gently on the cloth beside the other items. His movements careful, almost reverent now, because he understood that he was not just handling objects. He was handling someone's life, someone's choices, someone's attempt to leave something behind that would not be lost. And he leaned back slightly, resting his weight on his heels, his eyes moving once more across the contents of the box, the letters, the tag, the photograph, the document. And for the first time since he had opened the storage unit, the question in his mind was no longer, what is this worth? But what is this asking of me? And the difference between those two questions settled heavily into the quiet space, because one was about survival, about money, about getting through the next day, and the other was about responsibility, about meaning, about stepping into something larger than himself. And Daniel felt the edge of that realization press against him, not overwhelming, but undeniable. And he exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to Rex, who met it without hesitation, calm, steady, as if reminding him that he was not standing at this moment alone. And Daniel gave a small nod, almost to himself, as if acknowledging a decision that had not yet been fully spoken. And in the stillness of that forgotten unit, with dust hanging in the air and light stretching across the floor in thin lines, he understood that whatever path this discovery was about to open, it would not be about luck, and it would not be about chance, it would be about what he chose to do next with something that had clearly been meant to be found. Daniel remained still for a long moment after setting the document down, not because he did not understand what he had found, but because he understood just enough to know that this was no longer about guessing. And that realization carried a quiet weight that settled deeper than anything he had felt since stepping into the unit. And he reached again for the photograph, lifting it carefully, his eyes tracing the details with more intention now. The man in the image standing straight, but not rigid, the kind of posture that came from years of discipline softened by something gentler. And beside him the German shepherd, alert but calm, not posing, not performing, just present. The kind of presence that did not need to prove itself. And Daniel studied the way the man's hand rested lightly against the dog's neck, not gripping, not commanding, just there, a connection built on trust rather than control. and something in that simple detail pressed into him harder than anything written on the document, because it felt familiar in a way that did not need explanation, and he lowered the photograph slowly, placing it back onto the cloth with care, his fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary, and then he reached for another envelope, this time not at random, but from the top row, one that looked slightly more worn than the others, as if it had been opened and closed more than once before being sealed again, and he slid it open gently, pulling out the folded letter inside, his movements steady but more deliberate now, and as he unfolded it, the paper revealed lines written in the same careful hand, but the tone was different this time, more personal, more direct, and Daniel's eyes moved across the words slowly, taking in each line, not rushing, because something told him this one mattered more, and as he read, the quiet of the storage unit seemed to deepen, the distant sounds fading until it was just the soft rustle of paper and the steady rhythm of his own breathing, and the letter spoke of time running short, not in a dramatic way, not with fear, but with a kind of acceptance that felt steady, grounded, and it spoke of trust, not in systems or institutions, but in the idea that what mattered would find its way to the right hands, even if those hands were unknown, and Daniel felt his throat tighten slightly as he reached the final lines, where the writer had not asked for anything in return, had not demanded action, but had simply expressed a quiet hope that whoever found these things would understand their weight, and would choose to carry it forward in whatever way felt right, and Daniel lowered the letter slowly, his fingers holding it a moment longer before folding it back along the original creases, and he placed it carefully into the envelope, sliding it back into its place among the others, and for a second, he just sat there, his gaze fixed on the box, the contents no longer scattered pieces, but parts of something whole, something intentional, and he let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing just slightly, not because the situation had become easier, but because it had become clearer, and clarity, even when it brings responsibility, has a way of steadying a man who has been drifting too long, and Rex shifted again beside him, pressing his side gently against Daniel's arm, the contact subtle but firm, and Daniel rested his hand against the dog's back once more, his fingers moving absently through the fur, grounding himself in the one thing that had not changed since the beginning of this day, and he looked down at the hidden compartment, at the lifted concrete, at the box that had been waiting beneath it, and then back at the open unit filled with things that had been left behind, and for the first time, the word junk no longer fit any of it, because what he had found was not discarded, it was preserved, not abandoned, but entrusted, and Daniel Hayes understood that the moment he chose to open that box, guided by a dog who refused to move from a quiet corner, was not the moment his luck changed, it was the moment his path did, and whatever came next would not be measured in dollars or days, but in the choices he made with something that had been left in silence, waiting to be seen. Daniel did not close the box right away, even though every instinct from his past life told him to secure what he had found, to contain it, to move on to the next step. But something about this moment asked for stillness instead of action, for understanding instead of urgency, and he remained where he was on the cold concrete floor, the storage unit quiet around him, the air carrying the faint scent of dust and old wood. And he looked again at the contents laid out before him. The envelopes, the photograph, the dog tag, the document, each piece no longer separate, but part of something that had been built carefully, deliberately, by someone who had known exactly what they were leaving behind, and Daniel's eyes moved slowly across them, not searching for value anymore, but for meaning, and he felt it now more clearly than before. This was not hidden for protection alone, it was hidden for discovery, and that difference settled into him with a quiet weight that felt almost like purpose, and he reached again for the photograph, lifting it into the light that stretched in through the open door, and he studied it longer this time, not just the man and the dog, but the background, the faint outline of a house behind them, the slope of the land, the shape of a porch railing just visible along the edge, small details that had not mattered before now beginning to form something more tangible, something that could be followed, and Daniel's brow tightened slightly. As he leaned in closer, his thumb brushing lightly against the edge of the photo as if that would bring more clarity, and he noticed something he had missed earlier, a small number painted on the side of the porch, partially obscured but still there, faded but readable if you looked long enough, and he exhaled slowly, his mind beginning to move in a different direction now, not inward, not reflective, but outward, searching, connecting. And he lowered the photograph carefully, placing it back beside the other items, and his gaze shifted to the document once more, the official language, the names, the references that now felt less distant, less abstract, and he realized that this was not meant to stay here, not meant to sit hidden beneath concrete and dust. It was meant to move, to reach beyond this space. And that realization did not come with pressure. It came with a quiet clarity that felt steady, like a path appearing where there had only been uncertainty before. And Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing slightly as he sat back, his hand resting once more against Rex's back, feeling the warmth, the steady presence that had guided him here without a single word. And Rex remained calm, his eyes soft but attentive, as if he understood that the work was not finished, that finding something is only the first step. And Daniel gave a small nod, more to himself than to the dog, acknowledging what he already knew, that whatever came next would not be easy, not in the practical sense, because he still had no home, no steady income, no clear way forward in the world outside this storage unit. But something inside him had shifted, something that did not rely on those things, something that felt like direction. And he began to gather the items carefully, not hurried, not careless, placing each envelope back into the box, stacking them in the same order they had been kept, folding the cloth back around the tag and the photograph and the document with deliberate movements, as if preserving not just the objects but the intention behind them. And when he closed the lid, the soft click of the clasp sounded different now, not like something being sealed away, but like something being prepared to be carried. And he held the box for a moment in both hands, feeling its weight, not heavy, but significant. And he stood slowly, his knees stiff from the time spent on the floor, and he looked around the unit one last time, at the broken furniture, the scattered debris, the things that would still look like junk to anyone else who walked in. And he understood now that value is not always visible at first glance, that sometimes it waits beneath layers, beneath surfaces, beneath places no one thinks to look. And he stepped toward the door, the light outside brighter now, the sound of the world returning gradually, distant voices, the hum of engines, life continuing as it always had, unaware of what had just changed inside this small, forgotten space. And Rex moved with him, close, steady, his presence constant. And as Daniel crossed the threshold, the box held securely in his hands, he did not feel like a man who had just found something to sell. He felt like a man who had been entrusted with something to return, and that difference, quiet as it was, carried more weight than anything he had held in a very long time. The sun had shifted higher by the time Daniel stepped out of the storage unit, the light warmer now, stretching across the gravel lot in long pale lines that softened the sharp edges of everything it touched. And for a moment he stood there without moving, the small metal box held steady in his hands, not heavy in weight, but grounded in a way that made him aware of every step he was about to take. And Rex stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, his presence quiet, constant, as if the dog had already accepted whatever path this moment was leading them toward. And Daniel drew in a slow breath, the air outside carrying a mix of engine fumes and distant pine, something cleaner than the stale quiet of the unit. And he looked back once over his shoulder at the open door, at the space that had seemed empty just an hour before, and now felt like a place that had quietly handed him something more than he had known to look for. And then he turned away, because staying would not change anything, and he began to walk across the lot, his boots crunching lightly over gravel, each step steady, not rushed, not uncertain, just forward. And as he reached the edge of the storage facility, the world beyond came back into full view, cars passing along the road, people moving through their own routines, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place inside a forgotten unit. And Daniel paused near his old car, the faded paint catching the sunlight in dull patches, the kind of vehicle that had seen better years and kept going anyway. And he set the box carefully on the hood for a moment, resting his hands against the metal, feeling the slight warmth from the sun. And he looked down at Rex, who met his gaze with the same calm certainty he had carried all morning. And Daniel gave a small nod, not as a command, not as a signal, but as an acknowledgement, a shared understanding that whatever came next would be faced together, just as everything before had been, and he opened the car door, placing the box gently on the passenger seat, securing it as if it were something that could not be replaced. And when he closed the door, the sound felt final in a way that settled something inside him, not ending the story, but beginning the next part of it, and he walked around to the driver's side, pausing once more before getting in, his eyes drifting back to the photograph. Still clear in his memory, the house, the porch, the number partially visible, small details that now carried direction, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out the folded piece of paper he had tucked away earlier, the one that held the name and the address he had carefully written down from the clues in the box, and he looked at it for a long second, not because he doubted it, but because he understood what it meant to follow it, that this was not just a place on a map, it was a step into someone else's story, one that had been waiting, quietly, for someone to continue it. And Daniel Hayes, a man who had spent months drifting without direction, now held something that pointed forward, not with urgency, but with purpose, and he folded the paper back carefully, placing it into his jacket pocket, and then he climbed into the car, the seat worn but familiar, the smell of old fabric and dust wrapping around him like something known, and Rex jumped into the passenger side with a smooth motion, settling beside the box, his body angled slightly toward it as if guarding it without being asked, and Daniel started the engine, the sound rough but steady, and as the car pulled out onto the road, the storage facility fading behind them, he did not feel like a man who had just escaped something. He felt like a man who had been given a direction, and the road ahead stretched out in quiet lines beneath the midday light. Not dramatic, not extraordinary, just open, and sometimes that is all a man needs. Not certainty, not guarantees, just a path and the will to follow it. And as the miles began to pass, the rhythm of the drive settling into something steady and calm, Daniel glanced once toward Rex, who sat quietly, eyes forward, present in a way that did not need words, and Daniel's grip on the steering wheel eased just slightly, because for the first time in a long while, he was not driving away from something. He was driving toward it, and whatever waited at the end of that address, whatever story had been left unfinished, he knew one thing with a quiet certainty that did not need explanation, that he had not found that box by accident, and that sometimes the smallest decision made in a moment when everything feels lost is the one that leads you exactly where you were meant to go.